Yeah, I guess to start this off, I'm curious what got you into lifting and what's kind of made you stick it out and make it a career.
So honestly, it was kind of just random chance. I used to be a competitive boxer and Muay Thai fighter, and that basically took up most of my life. So I would train 3 hours in the morning, work, train 3 hours after, and so didn't really have a whole lot of time for anything else. And so when I decided to retire, so to speak, I was coaching an athlete who was a very high level athlete. He was just starting to learn how to box, but he was a two-time Olympian in bobsleigh. And so he was a very, very strong, very athletic guy, and he was like super jacked. And I was like, well, I kind of want to stay active. So, what do you think I should do? And he's like, oh, start Olympic weightlifting. So I was like, okay. So I started weightlifting, and one of the guys at the facility that I was training out of found out about my athletic history and some of my accomplishments, and he's like, "Oh, you should come work for me as a trainer." And so I was like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" And so I, went and got my diploma or whatever, and then he hired me. That was basically it. So it was kind of random chance. I was a chef prior to that, working
Yeah.
in the fine dining industry, so it was a pretty big shift. But I liked being active. I had no conception of what being a PT was about, to be honest. I just thought I'd get paid to work out. It's not
Yeah.
obviously what it is. Um, and then I just really enjoyed it. Like I loved training. I loved the challenges that were involved. I loved, meeting new people and learning. And so it it was kind of cool because I have to learn all of the stuff to be a good coach, but then I also get to learn and be able to apply it to myself and in my own training and goals and things like that. So,
hmm Did you find this has happened to me in my life a few times, but if you're very passionate about something and then it becomes a career, did you feel like that kind of removed some of the love from it, or did it increase it for you?
no, I've heard a lot of people say that, and I can definitely understand that. Um, but that definitely has never been the case for me. I've always really enjoyed it. I've always enjoyed training. I've always enjoyed learning. Um, and so essentially, it's kind of acts as multiple um, things for me, right? So it's a creative outlet. It's an opportunity to learn. It's an
Mhm.
opportunity to actually like be engaged and problem solve and challenge myself. And then I actually get the physical aspect as well through, the process of training, competition, things like that. So
Mhm. And having to educate people and coach people makes you have to be you know, you need to know your stuff. So you need to be able to explain it to people. When you're just training yourself, it's a lot different than when you have to communicate these ideas about training to other people. It makes you really you know, make everything concrete.
yeah, I mean, when you're coaching yourself, there's a lot to be gained from that. There's a lot of experience, there's a lot of understanding, but essentially you have an n equals one cohort, right? So whether or not the things that you're doing are going to be generalizable is really up for debate. And so when you have to coach multiple people, you start seeing different problems, like working with different demographics, working with individuals with injury, than even just the side of adherence, right? Like, are they even adhering to it? How do you scale and progress different interventions? How do you develop interventions? How do you pivot when something happens? Um, so there's a variety of different things that comes up that makes it pretty interesting. But then, you know, I mean, I've only been in this role as director of education for probably about 6 months now,
Mhm.
and it's such a steep learning curve because, like you said, there's a huge difference between training yourself and training clients. But then there's a much bigger difference between being like an educated coach versus being an educator, right? Like the amount of depth that you have in a variety of different fields is pretty impressive. And then obviously they just kind of present different challenges as well in terms of how am I going to communicate this stuff? Like, let's say hypothetically, we were going to make a course on nutrition for powerlifting. Do we need to cover protein metabolism? Like, how deep do we need to go? You know, and like, what's going to be applicable for the individual, and then what's going to be interesting for them as well. And so it's like it's a completely new challenge, which I really enjoy. And yeah, like you said, you definitely have to really, really be familiar with the research and have a lot of practical experience as well to be able to actually communicate these things and apply them to real world situations.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, one thing, I actually worked as a personal trainer for a little bit, and one thing that I don't know what your experience is. Um, I guess you could say actually adhering to the information you're giving the person. Like adherence seems to be the biggest issue, and when you're really passionate about training, there's a temptation to be like, how do you not just want to do this? How do you not like just want to like stick to this plan?
mhm.
Making people give a shit. Like the demographic that you work with, by the time people get to you, are they taking their training and nutrition very seriously at that point?
I would say 95% of the time or more, yeah. Um, I mean, when I started out, obviously, it was a different cohort of clientele. So I
Hmm.
was training Gen Pop. I think pretty much everyone, the vast majority of people, anyways, get their start in Gen Pop. So that was definitely an issue. And unfortunately, in the training world, I think only recently have the soft skills of coaching and really focusing on the relationships and adherence and communication kind of taken a little bit more of a sort of front facing position.
Hmm.
When I was first coming up, it definitely wasn't the case. It was all about like, the Poliquin, 4 to 6 rep range is functional hypertrophy, and 8 to 12 is hypertrophy, and 5 and under is and just like these very kind of hard lined sort of stances that are supposed to be science based, probably are not, but then as obviously as I've gained more experience and with the clientele I'm working right now, I definitely enjoy working more with people who are um, more invested, just because that allows me to problem solve a little bit differently. But
Hmm.
I think the adherence piece is really, really undervalued, because I still obviously have to work and enhance an individual's adherence. It just looks differently where these things come up, right? So
Hmm.
maybe an athlete's not getting enough sleep. Like, they're always getting their training in, but they're not getting sufficient sleep, or maybe their nutrient timing is off. And these things aren't necessarily going to matter for Gen Pop. But if you're, an international elite athlete who's trying to really scrape and fight for every single, ounce of progress, those things become substantially more important.
Hmm.
Um, so it's a bit of a different game, but that's definitely what I prefer. I'm not really a huge fan of training beginners anymore.
Yeah.
Although that still depends. That still depends, because I do have a couple of like complete beginners, and I really love training them. So I think it's kind of like a person by person. um,
Yeah. Well, the attitude is important. I know for me, if you're training people that just kind of are, and maybe this reflects my uh lack of skills as a coach, but you just can't really get someone to get on board. And they're almost just going through the motions, and they bought a gym pass, they bought a personal training package just to feel like they're doing something. Or yeah, like Gen Pop, it tends to be it's rare to finally get someone who's really on board with sticking to something. But I have limited experience, so I'm not saying my opinion or perspective is correct or anything. But I can imagine, training people, even if they are beginners, just having the attitude of I want to get better. And going relating to what you said with when you're working with elite people who are trying to get elite results, dialing in everything, like everything needs to be dialed in, sleep. And this is something I've been thinking about, is all the things that don't have anything to do with the gym that can affect your results. So whether that be, I'm even thinking about, like, let's say you're someone who is financially struggling, so you're stressed all the time. Let's say your relationship is falling apart, so you're stressed all the time. It's like you need to have your personal life and your affairs in order in that way. And there's other things, I don't know if you're into like meditation and stuff like that. I don't really meditate, but there are certain like things that you can do to control stress. So what are things outside of the gym that don't really have to do with training, but can correlate to your like that can affect your results in the gym?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and I think this stuff becomes especially more pronounced the more advanced you become as a lifter or athlete in general. So, like when I'm discussing or when I'm doing an intake with one of my athletes, so brand new person, never met them before. The onboarding process is a lot, like mostly talking about their lifestyle.
Hmm.
So yes, I collect data on their, historical training logs. Yes, I collect data on their sleep and on, their anything else that I need that's a little bit more like hard data. But then I also ask a lot of questions that are more subjective in nature. So talking about their general mood, talking about their stress levels, talking about what sort of goals they have in their life, what other priorities they have outside of the gym, whether it be career, relational, recreational, social, whatever.
Hmm.
It's really, really important to understand the individual as a whole because you can't separate that person from the rest of their life, right? So if exactly like you said, someone's having, a really stressful time with their partner or their significant other, that may very well bleed into their training performance. That will absolutely cut into their recovery resources.
Mm.
It might distract them, so it might kind of, pull away from their cognitive faculties and their ability to actually maintain a high level of focus and output during training. It may disrupt their nutrient timing because they're just not as focused on those things. So I think ultimately, like you don't necessarily need to have your whole life in order, but you do need to at some point sit down and go over the potential trade-offs that you're willing to make. So for a very, very long time, I was doing a lot of different things and I was working crazy hours as an in-person PT. Like if you're doing 100 sessions per month one-on-one, you're generally a pretty good PT, right? I was doing between 210 and 230 a month, all one-on-ones, right?
Are you a pretty social guy?
No,
Because I feel like a
I'm not at
person
all.
I'm similar to you. I think I kind of get a vibe that you're a pretty introverted guy.
Mhm.
I'm the same way. I can socialize and like put on I can socialize and be friendly for a while, but for me, personal training just sucked the life out of me because it's like you gotta show up and be there. And if you're
Mhm.
not very extroverted and if you don't have the ability to be social for quite a duration of time, it can definitely just zap the energy out of you.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened in my case anyways. And so essentially I was working really long hours, but I was making a lot of money, and so that was my priority at the time. And I was always kind of working towards this idea of like, okay, I'm going to work online. I'm going to have more flexibility. I'm going to be able to sleep and eat like a professional athlete, do all these things that I need to do. And that's the lifestyle that I eventually want. And so it took
Mhm.
a very long time, but that's the life that I actually have now. If I don't want to work, I don't work. Uh, like I could probably, do cut my workday in half and still get everything done that I need to get done.
Mhm.
But I enjoy working, and like my main point in that is, I sat down and said, okay, what sort of lifestyle do I want to live? What kind of trade offs do I need to make? And it can be very difficult sometimes because people might have a lot of things that are all really important to them. Their careers are really important, their relationships are really important, their social life is really important, and I think the biggest difficulty is cognitive dissonance around that or ambivalence around, what their priorities actually are because everyone wants to say, "Oh, I'm dedicated. I'm all in." When I hear people say I'm all in, almost certainly you're not all in because you don't I don't think you really understand, like not you, just in general. I don't think people necessarily understand what that means. Like as an example, if an athlete tells me they're all in, and I've had several athletes, at a reasonable high level tell me they're all in, and I say, okay, are you willing to take any amount of drugs that it's going to take if you want to compete at World's Strongest Man? because that's an untested. You're on drugs. If you're there, you're on.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
You know, so it's like, are you willing to take all the drugs that are necessary to do that? Are you willing to do that for years? Are you willing to gain up to maybe 150 pounds, whether it's fat or muscle, to get to the size you need to hit those numbers? Are you willing to sacrifice your health? Are you willing to sacrifice your relationships? Are you willing to like do everything that you need to do? Like, if you're missing birthdays, if you're missing parties, if you're missing funerals, sometimes it's what you need to do to get your training in, you know? And it's like, that might sound crazy, but it's like, that's what all in actually means. Now, do you need that to get to a high level? No. Do you need that to be the number one in the world?
Most likely.
To some extent, you do need that, but you don't necessarily need all of that. You don't necessarily need to always be at the extreme. But my only point in saying that is that, a lot of the times people haven't even uncovered the the most basic stones. They haven't even kind of looked under the most basic things like, hey, are you getting 8 hours of sleep a night?
Mm.
Because if you want to be an elite athlete, that's probably not enough. If you really want to be the best of the best, 10 to 13 hours a night,
Really?
you know?
I've heard
Like,
that. I'm not let's stick on that because that interests me because I've heard that, athletes need to sleep for just an outrageous length of time. And like are there where do the recovery benefits come in? When I think of like a good solid 8 hours of sleep, I'm like, "Oh yeah, had a good sleep." But when you say something like 10 to 13 hours, that's like, "Holy shit, that eats into half your day."
mhm.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
that's interesting. So like what would be the benefits of sleeping for that long? It's really like just a ton more recovery.
Enhanced recovery, injury risk reduction, um, improved cognitive focus, improved um, level of perceived effort. And so when I say that, I mean essentially you're going to be reducing your level of perceived effort to some extent. So um, I guess I'll try and be a little bit more precise. So there's a big difference between adequate sleep, sleep restriction, and then sleep extension. So sleep extension is what I'm talking about.
Mm.
That's where you're getting, sleep in excess of what probably your, an adequate amount would be. But there's significant benefit to that. So sleep restriction, just after like one night of sleep, even, you can see increased sensitivity to pain. So
Mhm.
if you have discomfort, if you have an injury or something like that, it can be made worse. You can have increased subjective evaluation of difficulty. So doing a top set of 5 and RP8 for squats might actually feel like an RP9. Even though you're prepared to do it and you can do it, it's going to feel more difficult. Um, your reaction time, speed, power is all reduced, right? And then there's a difference between acute sleep restriction and chronic sleep restriction. So if you're chronically sleep restricted, your strength is absolutely going to be impacted. Your risk of injury goes up. Your cognitive performance goes down. Your ability to problem solve goes down. Your
Mhm.
actual ability and desire to take on difficult tasks goes down. So your motivation to do those things actually goes down. So there's so many issues with sleep restriction, even just outside of all of the major health issues, like your risk of all-cause mortality goes up, right?
Yeah.
Your hunger signaling can be disrupted. Your hormones can be disrupted. Your like just everything basically bad that can happen will happen if you are
Yeah.
underslept for a significant amount of time. Then when you start getting adequate amounts of sleep, what you're able to do is you're able to perform well and recover between training sessions, right? You get, sufficient restoration. You get like you're solidifying. Oh gosh, what is it? I can't remember exactly what it is, but memory and your cognitive
Mm.
faculties essentially become like solidified. It's almost like it has this cyclic process during the evening.
Yeah, it's like a scrubs your brain in a very bro science term or something like
Yeah,
that.
I can't remember exactly what it's called off the top of my head, but yeah, and then when you start getting into sleep extension, that's where you actually see enhanced ability to push really hard. So if you were to max out every single day, like now I'm not talking about what can you do today, I'm talking about your actual 1 rep max in competition. If you were to try and do that every day, you'd break down pretty darn quick, right?
Mhm.
But if you, adopt, let's say, a sleep extension approach, your ability to recover and perform would be sustained for longer. Now, does that mean that's what I recommend? No. However, it does sort of suggest that, hey, if you're getting sufficient sleep and you can tack on more on top of that, obviously to a point there's going to be diminishing returns. But if you can get, let's say, 10 or 12 hours of sleep a night, you're going to be able to sustain a very, very high level of performance for a long period of time. And so, session to session, set to set, you're going to be able to maintain a higher level of training output. Now, that might not make a difference in terms of your performance from one week to the next, although I would definitely argue that you would see a very immediate benefit. I have with all of my athletes who have done this, I've seen very, very quick benefits. But just extrapolate that over 5 or 10 years of training and how much farther along you're going to be. And that's just talking about sleep. Now, what
Mhm.
happens if we dial in your nutrition, your nutrient timing, your macronutrient composition, your food quality, optimizing your gut health, looking at protein timing and hydration and all of these things in your supplementation. Then we can start looking at stress reduction or stress management. And it's just like there's so many different things you can do, and how much
Mhm.
time you have to allocate to that, and how committed are you to that process. And it's not up to me to say you should be doing this and you should be doing that because that's what's best. If I'm coaching an athlete, their goals are their goals, and we have a very, very clear conversation around that initially. So we're both on the same page. We both know what sort of trade offs are going to have to be made. And then we communicate the shortcomings of, or not the shortcomings, but essentially, yeah, the outcomes that are going to occur if they're not willing to do A, B, or C, or if they are willing to do A, B, or C. Right. And so, and then that's an ongoing conversation as well, because as people get more advanced, usually their ability to tolerate higher levels of complexity goes up as well. And their desire usually does as well, because they're becoming more advanced, they're really enjoying, they're really bought into the process. So, where before maybe they didn't really care about their nutrition, now they're like, hey, you know what? Maybe I do want to take a look at this again. Maybe I
Mhm.
do want to start learning a little bit more about supplementation.
Mhm.
And I think that when you get all of those, kind of big rocks and those big fundamental things dialed in, now all of those little things, those little details like nutrient timing, which normally only have a small impact, can have a very significant impact. Because if you were to adopt a nutrient timing strategy, but your general diet and your sleep and your training wasn't that great, you're probably not going to see any difference at all, right? That's very likely. But that's because it's all getting washed out by all the other shitty decisions that individual's making.
Mhm.
And once you come more advanced and you start getting your lifestyle and all those everything else really, really dialed in, now each individual lever that you're pulling to create some sort of training adaptation has a very significant benefit because it's a synergistic effect, not just an isolated adaptation.
Mhm. Wow, there's a lot to go in there.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, the sleep thing. So let's say, do you work with a lot, so you work with a lot of athletes, but let's say, okay, do you work with people who have just personal goals, not necessarily athletic goals? Like say I'm all in about, achieving the best physique I can possibly achieve as a natural bodybuilder or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, but I have maybe this isn't my like I'm not a professional. I'm not a professional, so it's not my full-time thing. You're talking about, being all in. I think about this a lot with myself, like I'm very passionate about lifting, and I want to in my lifetime do what I can to maximize my genetic potential, whatever you want to say. Um, but like you said, when you start bringing up certain things like, well, would you miss this? Would you, like all the things you have to give up in order to achieve that? There's got to be, for me, like, I'm going to have to pull back on certain things. I'm not going to like miss funerals to go train and stuff like that. Um, and I'm wondering, what was I going to say? So what I'm saying is, like 10 hours of sleep for a bodybuilder, that's a significant amount of time. But let's go into the sleep thing a bit more. So 10 hours of sleep. what would that, like what in let's say like 6 months, like what would 10 hours of sleep do for an individual? Like it's gonna make a huge difference kind of thing for someone's physique?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely could. So I just want to clarify something though. Um, my position is not that, the whole quote unquote all in. I don't believe that you necessarily need to
Yeah.
do all of those crazy things in order to achieve top level results. What I was saying is that when people say they're all in, that's what that means.
Okay,
You
okay,
know?
yeah.
But like, I don't have any athletes missing funerals or any of
Yeah.
that shit. Like, I just don't. Personally, I think that it is good to have a semblance of balance. Now, balance doesn't mean in the middle. You can have balance at extremes, right?
Yeah.
If you're a professional athlete, obviously, and you're like, if you're an IFBB pro and you're doing very well in the circuit, your level of balance is going to look very different than everyone else's. Like, you're still very strict and very disciplined, right?
Mhm.
However, there are other things you do in order to create balance in your life. So it's not all just work and you actually enjoy your life and you enjoy the process. So I just kind
Mhm.
of want to clarify that because in no way, shape, or form am I suggesting that it's even productive to adopt an all in strategy.
Yeah. That's
Um,
fair.
I think that my point was only to say that when people say they're all in, they don't understand what they're actually saying. You
Mhm.
know, um, and if you do understand what all in means, then you can kind of go along that scale and say, okay, where do I fall on that? And that's where that individualization component comes in. And again, it's an ongoing conversation you have with your athletes. So to get to your actual question about sleep extension and where you might see yourself after 6 months, um, I can't say for an individual, but like in particular, but what I can say are just sort of give you generalizations about what typically will occur. So if your sleep is extended, first and foremost, you're going to be asleep for longer, which means that you actually have less opportunity for eating. If you're awake less, your hunger is going to be to some degree blunted, right? Like if you're awake for 16 hours, you're probably going to get really hungry, or like X amount of hours doesn't matter, but like you're probably going to get really hungry at some point. But if you were to sleep 13 hours, there's less opportunity to be hungry.
Mhm.
So that is a subjective benefit, right? But it's also a non-negligible benefit, or it can be. Maybe not to everyone, but it can be to some. If you're sleeping a significant amount, let's say again 10 hours, your training performance is going to be sustained, especially during, those really extreme cuts. Is it
Yeah.
going to preserve all of it? Probably not, but you're going to preserve a lot more than if you hadn't done that,
Mhm.
right? You're going to be able to just recover faster. So the regeneration process is actually going to just be better supported, right? Um, so there's a lot of things that can happen. Again, I can't say, oh, it's going to help you put 10 kilos on your squat or something like that, right? But I mean, mechanistically, we know a lot of things that'll occur as a result of sleep
Mhm.
extensions. Like, what does sleep do? What does sleep extension do? We've got a fair bit of research on both, um, and you would just sort of have to like weigh that into the trade-offs. But it's obviously going to be a very significant benefit for people if that's something that they can do without maybe causing downstream issues in their life. So, if sleeping that extra bit is taking away time from, your kids or your wife or husband or whatever it might be, then that might cause another problem. So it kind of has to be weighed against some of the other things.
Yeah.
Again, this is the discussion about trade-offs that I was talking about earlier. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about it because it's like, that's like a work day of sleep every 4 days. If you're, if you're usually sleeping 8 hours, then you switch to 10 hours. I'm like, wow, it's a significant dedication of time towards sleep. And I didn't really I got to look at that literature because I didn't actually realize, I always thought like 7 to 8 hours was enough for adequate recovery. But if there's like that crazy of a benefit for just adding 2 hours, I'll definitely have to look into that because I'm curious about that because I could rearrange my life to even maybe just bump it up to 9 hours or something like that. But
So the thing is, like, it doesn't necessarily need to be a drastic change. Like, if I'm trying to get an athlete to sleep to improve their sleep, I'm not asking them to sleep for X amount more hours. All I'll say is, like, let's say they go to bed at midnight. I'll say, "Hey, I want you to try going to bed at 11:45 instead. 15 minutes, that's it." Right? They do that for a couple days. "Hey, no big deal. Okay, maybe next week we try and get to bed at 11:30."
Mm.
Right? Then maybe the next week we try to get to bed at 11. So over the span of 3 weeks in this example, we've, given them an additional hour. But a lot of the times, if you try and make these very, very significant jumps, like going from 0 to 100, it just doesn't work out very well. So,
Yeah.
I will typically recommend something a little bit more manageable. Now, hey, you know what? If we say 15 minutes and they're like, "Oh, easy, done," and they're actually doing it, then I might, you'll accelerate the process. So you scale it to the individual's ability.
Hmm.
But, it doesn't always need to be this huge thing. And oftentimes it's actually probably better from a sustainability and adherence standpoint if it's not such a drastic jump. Um, Yeah, just sort of as a side point.
Cool, man. Let's jump into nutrition a little bit as well. Um, as far as you coaching people on their nutrition, do you feel like nutrition is a very individualized thing? I know people like to say like, oh, it's very nutrition is very individual, but do you see like pretty much just the basic nutritional principles working on everybody the same way for the most part?
Yeah, so I think what a lot of people probably mean when they say nutrition is very individual is that the application of nutrition principles is very individual.
Mm,
So, I mean, energy balance is energy balance.
yeah, period.
There's nothing really fancy about that, and it doesn't change from person to person. It's always going to be true. Um, Athletes are always going to need protein. If you're looking to optimize your performance, you're going to have to eat a lot of carbohydrates, regardless of what people who are big advocates of, high fat, low carb diets say. Carbohydrates are very clearly a benefit to performance, right? Um, so there's a lot of things that are just like kind of fundamental across the board. But what if an individual has diabetes? What then? What if an individual has like just some odd gut issues and they can't eat certain foods that normally are considered really healthy, super nutrient dense, but they just really cause GI distress for that individual? What then? Right? So these are those things that you have to look at. And I mean, even if we go to, easier problems to solve, like they just don't know what the fuck they're doing.
Mm,
They've never dieted before. They've never done any of these things. So it's like you talk to them about macronutrients and all stuff. And ultimately, you have to get them bought in. So again, I think this is where if you're a coach, you have to do a very good job in that initial, uh, you know, consultation, onboarding, whatever it is you call that. You have to do a very good job at, evaluating their needs. So the needs analysis is an incredibly important part. If you've done a proper needs analysis without even putting pen to paper, their program, their training program, and their nutrition program should basically already be written. Now
mm,
you're just actually putting everything into a framework, but it's basically already written, you know? So you need to have a very, very, very thorough conversation about these things. Like, hey, what's your experience with diet in the past? Do you have any sort of, issues? Are you a chronic dieter? What have you tried? What have you tried that worked? What have you tried that didn't work? What sort of constraints do you have? Do you have any time constraints? Do you have financial constraints? Do you have social constraints? Are you let's say in corporate sales and you have to consistently have lunches with clients, you
mm.
know um, do you have like a history of disordered eating, or even do you present with some disordered eating behavior even though it's not, even though it's subclinical at this point? um, like there's so many different things, and then once you get to know that individual through that conversation, then you can see, okay, like what's my starting point? And the starting point is really important because you want to start building up success for an individual very rapidly. Because if they start experiencing success, they get more bought in. It increases their sense of self efficacy. It increases their level of relatedness because they're like, hey, this person's actually listening to me, and they're really adapting this intervention to me and where I'm at right now. And it also enhances their level of competence because I mean, I think one of the big mistakes that people make when it comes to nutrition is they look at each individual constituent or like each individual component of nutrition in isolation. They say, can I eat broccoli? Yes, I can eat broccoli. Okay. Can I portion out my meals? Yes, I can portion out my meals. Can I do this? Yes, I can do this. But then it's like, that's not the point. You can teach anyone to throw a jab, like a pretty damn good jab in, a week. Within 1 week, you can get a lot of people, if you're really coaching them well, to throw a pretty
Mm.
solid jab. Put that person in a fight and see if they're able to do it again, right?
Yeah,
Because
I see what you're saying.
context
Yeah.
is different, right? The context is different. These things don't exist in isolation. They exist within a broader ecosystem, which is essentially your life, your work life, your social life, your personal life, all of these things. So I think when you look at it from that perspective, dieting is a skill. And when you recognize it as a skill, we have to scale
Mhm.
the intervention to the individual's ability. If someone comes in and says, like, hey, I want to squat 900 in reps, I'm not like, okay, cool, let's toss 900 on the bar and put you in reps. You know, it's like, okay, we see where you're at. And maybe you're not even ready to wear wraps yet. Maybe you can't even squat 400. If you can't even squat 400, for me, you're not fucking wearing wraps. You're not wearing wraps until you can squat at least 600, right? There's no fucking point in my mind, right?
Mhm.
There's just no point. So, um, and obviously, I'm thinking of larger individuals.
Yeah, yeah,
What I'm saying, I'm not thinking of
yeah.
a kilo girl. Just to clarify, but you kind of get what I'm saying, right? Like you
Mhm.
start them where they need to be, and wherever that is perfectly fine. And it might be really, really small, and then you just progress them from there. And probably one of the most important things, and I'll repeat this over and over and over, is scaling small. If the person's always fucking up, a lot of the times it's because the intervention wasn't designed properly. you know and some people might be like, oh well, no, it's because the person doesn't want it, and da 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 da. It's like, okay, well, if they're actually not that invested, you kind of should have had that conversation initially. You should have figured that out initially
Mhm.
during that initial, needs analysis. You need to be honest with them and say, hey, are you actually willing to do this? Can you 100% guarantee that you can stick to these behaviors no matter what's going on in your life? And if they say yes, then they've agreed to that. And you've also done a good job at setting expectations for them as well as setting what they can expect from you. And if you do a good job, 9 times out of 10, or probably even more than that, they're gonna stick to it, right?
Mhm.
Now, there are times where, someone just kind of doesn't give a fuck. And those people do exist. But the vast majority of time, they do care and they do genuinely want it. They're just struggling to put all the pieces together. And that's where the coach comes in.
Mhm. Do you drop clients that after a while, like if you take ownership as a coach and you set the expectations ahead of time, and then eventually if someone's not on board, do you kind of just drop them as a client? You
Um, I have done that in the past, probably once.
I don't
I've been
necessarily
a
think.
coach for like 10 years.
Yeah, like I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I mean, if you're not really helping that person and that person doesn't want your help, then why are you wasting your energy? It's not, if you can take on someone else who's actually going to take what you say. Or yeah, I'm curious how you navigate that.
So I guess I see it a little bit differently, right?
Okay.
Now, part of this is also because during the intake process, I ask them questions, right? Like, but before they've even signed up for coaching, right? Like, I'll always sit down with someone because I want to know whether or not we're going to be a good fit. And there are times, more than once, where I have just said, hey, you know what? I actually don't think that we're a good fit. I think that you'd be perfect for this person here, and I'll refer them out, and I'll explain why. I'll do it in a very professional way, but I'll just be like it's incredibly important for you to have a good relationship and for you guys to click, client and coach.
Mm.
Very, very important. If you look at therapy, this is something Dr. Lisa Lewis told me, which in retrospect is very unsurprising, but a lot of people don't necessarily put a lot of stock in it. Is one of the most significant determining factors of a successful, like, psychological intervention, like success in seeking out a help psychologically, is the relationship that you have with your client. right? Do they trust you? Do you jive? Like, do you guys sort of mesh? Do you understand each other? You know,
Mhm.
like you have to trust that person. And if you don't, you're not going to be honest with them, and you're not going to give it your all. You're not going to feel like they have your best interest in mind. You know what I mean? So it's very important that you guys are aligned. Now, again, it's pretty rare that that actually happens where I will refer someone out. That's
Mhm.
more in the case, I would say, of like if I have someone who has like is eating disorder,
Mm.
I will say, hey, before I'm even comfortable working with you, you need to be cleared by an actual qualified uh, clinician
Yeah.
who specializes in disordered eating behavior. Because for me, that's just like that's me being responsible. You know, like I don't want to take someone on and fuck them up.
Yeah.
I do know quite a lot about disordered eating. I've written several papers on them, but it's not my area of expertise.
Yeah.
So I will always refer them out. If someone has a very serious injury and I'm like, I don't feel confident coaching you based on your goals like that, I don't think that you're there and ready to do this type of training yet, I will refer them out. So it's more for reasons like that than it is for like, I just don't like you or I don't like your attitude. I think in the vast majority of cases, like, although, yeah, there are some people who just have shitty attitudes, um, those people probably aren't attracted to me in the first place.
Yeah. Fair
You
enough.
know? And so I don't really have to deal with that. I fired, you know, I don't even like to say it's fired. I essentially had to just say to a client one time, like, hey, you know what? I just don't think that this is working. I just don't think we jive. It seems like every suggestion I make, we kind of butt heads at. And so I think you'd be better off with this person. You know, I think that you guys would get along. And I'll tell you what, why don't you just take a free session with them, see if you enjoy it, and then go from there. Right.
Mhm.
And I just gave them their money back and was like, you know, go on your way, right? Like, because I don't want that because one, it's gonna be a bad thing for me, and it's gonna be a bad thing for them. It's gonna be wasted their money, wasted both of our time, and then it's just gonna make kind of be a bad reputation thing for me, right? Like, oh yeah, I trained with Daniel and he was just such a fucking dick, and I never got anywhere. And it's like, okay, but you never got anywhere because we just didn't jive and you never did anything, right? But that's
Yeah.
also my responsibility too to know that.
Mm.
But I've only ever done that once, and I've been coaching for about 10 years. So I don't think that that's like a thing that you should be doing. That's
Mhm.
like very much like an absolute last resort thing, you
No,
know?
that makes sense, man. That makes sense. I do want to take it back to nutrition. Do you? This is something I've recently kind of been experimenting with. I got the app Chronometer. Have you ever heard of that app before? It actually tracks micronutrients, and I'm wondering if you think it's all about the macros right now and stuff like that. But do you think tracking micronutrients is valuable, or is it a little bit crazy?
Um, I think valuable is a relative term, right? So, like an ice bath is not valuable to Joe Blow, right? Who's just like a weekend warrior.
Mm,
But an ice bath could be literally the difference between second and first place in a strongman competition,
okay. Okay.
right? Like in between events, you know, like so you have maybe if the competition spans a couple of days, it might be a very productive idea to have an ice bath to kind of reduce some of the inflammation so you can recover because you're not looking for an adaptation at that time, you're looking to recover to perform. So I'd say it's very relative. I have never and probably would never get an athlete to track their micronutrients. And I guess here's why, right? When I'm working with my clients, like probably one of the first things that we do, um, you know, and again, it is going to depend on the individual, but very, very often, one of the first things that I get them to do is increase their fruit and vegetable intake.
Mhm.
Right? My goal with them is to get them to eat between 6 and 10 servings combined of fruits and veggies per day. So it's not 6 and 10 each that's combined, right? If you're eating that much,
You're getting everything. Yeah.
more or like the likelihood that you're not is like, you know, I
Pretty.
mean, you're doing a pretty good job, you know? And because we're also like, I'm also recommending a variety of fruits and veggies, not just like, okay, just eat spinach, just eat broccoli. It's like, no,
Yeah.
get peas, get carrots, get like colorful vegetables, get like, mixed berries. So it's like you're getting tons of
Yeah.
phytonutrients, tons of antioxidants, tons of all of these things that are
Mhm.
really, really beneficial. And your micronutrients are pretty well going to be covered like that. Now, if you really want to be safe, you can take a high quality multivitamin. I don't think that's really necessary in the vast
No,
majority of
that
cases.
that's fair. If anything, for me, I have been tracking my micronutrients through that app, and I've just been realizing how important fruit and vegetables are. Because it's like even these people that
Yeah,
are like on their all meat diets, it's like meat's great. I'm a big meat eater, but vegetables matter, and that's one thing that
yeah,
tracking my micronutrients has showed me is that you know what, wow, like you eat some spinach and you're getting a lot like
yeah.
nutrient density. So maybe you don't have to track, but just this little experiment I've done has made me realize, wow, fruit and vegetables matter. So all these people that are into like the carnivore thing, it's definitely not the best way to do it.
Yeah, so my sister actually was carnivore for a long time.
Mm,
And it's funny because there's always like a strong degree of internal bias. So people often will come to me, especially people that I know, and they'll send me a research link or send me an article they saw, and they'll be like, "Hey, what do you think of this?" So they trust my judgment in 99% of cases, except for when it's something they believe. So
yeah.
I remember telling her, "Hey, you definitely need to be eating veggies and fruits." And then she was like, "Oh, well, I read this book. I can't remember what it's called, but I know it's a famous book because I've heard so many people talk about it. I just couldn't
Yeah.
remember the name. But essentially, it's like about how plants,
Have
like,
toxins.
yeah, something like that.
But if you actually look into the literature, those toxins are actually good for us. It's like,
It's just absurd from start to finish. It's absolutely fucking absurd.
yeah.
So it took me a long time to just kind of get it into her head, like, "Hey, this is bullshit. It's not real. It's just fucking nonsense. Eat if you want to go carnivore, sure, fine, but at least eat fruits and veggies on a very regular basis." And so now she's doing that. She eats lots of fruits and veggies. She still eats like just tons of meat. And she like if she goes out, she'll have stuff with carbs in it. It's not a big deal to her.
Yeah.
But so she's not as strict as she used to be, right? But which is a huge win. So she's getting high protein, which is awesome. She's getting lots of fruits and veggies, which is fantastic.
Mhm.
And she's not averse to eating carbs, which is a huge win psychologically. So I think generally she's doing a pretty good job. She's not a high performance athlete. She's not, she just wants to get strong and be fit and all that stuff.
Be
And
healthy.
she's quite lean and healthy and stuff like that. She's very active. So I think for the most part she's got her bases covered, especially since like she really enjoys that and it's
Mhm.
something that, is working well for her. So I'm like, you know what? That's perfectly fine, you know.
Mhm.
So
What what do you think about some of these evidence-based nutrition guys that are very they kind of they're very they push like the flexible dieting thing, and they'll say things like, well, as long as you're eating and as long as you're eating a certain amount of calories, like it doesn't matter if you start your day with a croissant and stuff like that. And I get it to a certain extent, but at the same time, like food choice matters. And you brought up earlier in this conversation like the quality of your food. There's some of these people that be like, there's no such thing as good or bad foods, but like you bringing up the quality of food is putting a judgment on that food. So obviously I think it's kind of silly to say there's no such thing as good or bad foods. I get the idea that like, oh, you ate a piece of bread. I obviously like, I'm not putting a moral judgment on food. I'm just saying food choice matters. That's what I'm saying.
yeah. Honestly, that's something that I do find it pretty annoying. Like people really rack their brains to find other words to use in substitute of good or bad. And it's
Yeah.
like, it's like, come on, man. Like just call a spade a spade. But the thing is, they do have a point to an extent, right? I think
Yeah.
the idea around that is to sort of, remove some of the stigma around certain foods. So that aspect I think is very beneficial and actually pretty important because realistically, a lot of the times people just don't understand nutrition. They don't understand how their body interacts with nutrition. They don't understand, what makes you fat or what makes you lean. They don't understand how to get fit, how to get healthy, like what's good, what's bad. They don't get it, right? And so I think, the conversation being more centered around calories, and then the idea of like saying, hey, there are no such things as good or bad foods, is sort of an attempt to do that. And
Yeah.
if we were to sort of take a reductionist approach, that's absolutely correct. Because, for instance, you might look at pizza and then like a bowl of fruit and say, hey, or let's say, because some people hate sugar. So fuck me, like a bowl of vegetables, right? And we'll say, okay, which one's good for you and which one's bad for you? And then they're like, oh, the pizza's bad for you, the veggies good. I'm like, okay, what if I told you to eat 10 pounds of veggies? They're like, well, it's probably going to suck. It's like, yeah, you're going to get crazy GI distress. You might have to go to the fucking hospital. You know? What if you only ate 1 gram of pizza? You know?
Yeah.
And people will look at that and be like, oh, that's ridiculous. No one's going to do that. But that's only really to demonstrate the broader point that food has a dose response relationship to the outcome that you're looking for, right?
Mhm.
So Eddie Hall, in order to maintain his, what he was like 425 or 430,
Yeah.
something like that, in order to do that, do you think there's any chance that he could ever achieve that eating only clean foods?
Fuck no.
No way. No way.
His
It's impossible.
videos, like his day of eating videos are absolutely insane.
Exactly, right? Him, Brian Shaw, Hafthor Bjornsson, when they were like at the peak,
Yeah.
there's no way. So from a performance standpoint, they needed that. They
Yeah.
needed to do that. So is it bad?
No.
Well, in the context of their health, yeah, it's probably not the greatest. But in the
Yeah.
context of performance, they're all fucking world's strongest men. So shut the fuck up. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So it's really relative, for an individual who has a history of disordered eating. Man, eating a cupcake could be incredibly empowering, right?
Mhm.
That's a very, very important point. And if no one's, if people aren't familiar with disordered eating behavior, like um, it can be very serious. Like anorexia kills people, literally kills people. I think it's actually the leading cause of psychological of just what is it? The leading cause of death from psychological disorders. I believe. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure, but I might have something wrong. So so I'm not a psychologist. So, but
Mhm.
it's very serious, right? And so for those individuals doing something like that and not experiencing shame and guilt and not having this major regression is a huge win. But if we're talking, if so we really have to like contextualize these conversations. When people say, "Oh, well, I thought that food was bad," okay, but what are we talking about, right?
Mhm.
Like, are we talking about someone who's just looking to lose weight? Or, are we talking about someone who's just wants to maintain a healthy lifestyle? If you're looking to maintain a healthy lifestyle, you've got a healthy body weight, you're very active on a regular basis, and this is, you enjoy some beers with your friends every now and then, like maybe once or twice a week, and you have like, a night out where you're eating pizza or whatever the fuck else, you're fine.
Maybe one way you could frame it, like contextually, if you're a struggling alcoholic, maybe you shouldn't have a beer. You know what I'm saying? Or like that. But
Yeah.
if you're a healthy guy who trains, eats well 80 to 90% of the time, you can go have a beer, eat some pizza, and in the context of your lifestyle, that's healthy. Does that make sense? Is that a good point? I don't know.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's the thing. It's very contextual. So a lot of the times these statements exist, without attachment. They're just sort of generalizable when in reality
Mhm.
they're not. I mean, a great example is like, hey, is spinach good for you? You would say yes. You said it a moment ago.
Yeah.
I know some people who, if they eat spinach, get the shits. Like they
Yeah.
just get crazy diarrhea. Don't know why. Just
Fair enough.
happens.
Yeah.
So, like, it's not always black and white. And I
Mhm.
mean, I think as a general rule, when we think of, like highly processed foods probably not being that great for you, yeah, I think that's probably pretty accurate. If you're eating a bunch of whole foods that are really nutrient dense, is that going to be pretty good for you? Yeah, that's pretty accurate. The thing is, I think the only time it becomes an issue is when you don't allow any room for nuance and context. That's the only
Yeah.
time it becomes an issue. If
Yeah.
I'm having a conversation with my clients, I don't fucking bother, doing all this mental gymnastics to come up with other words, right? For clean or dirty foods. I just say clean or dirty foods. They know what I
Yeah.
mean. Everyone knows what you mean when you say that, you know? The
Mhm.
only time, I think that becomes important is when you're creating a message around something. So if I'm giving a lecture or something like that, and it's specifically on food quality, I will explain what I mean, but then I will also still go on and say clean and dirty foods because everyone fucking knows what that means.
Yeah.
So I'm not so, concerned about playing all this fucking like these games of like these word games. I don't care. It's like people know what I mean,
Mhm.
and all I have to do is just have that caveat. Dirty, clean foods. By the way, it's contextual. It's dose response
Yeah.
relationship. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I mean, sometimes I'll phrase it in a way that's like, I'll say like, are these foods productive or unproductive for your goals? I might say it like that, right?
That's a good way to frame it.
Because now it's not about good or bad or clean or dirty or whatever. It's just like, is it serving your goals? Because productive foods can be highly processed or they can be super clean, you know?
Mm. Yeah.
So that's usually how I'll frame it if I feel like it's important to frame it in that particular way. But if I'm just having an offhand conversation with someone, I'm just not gonna fucking bother because it's just
Yeah.
it's not important.
That's definitely a pet peeve of mine is that kind of weird messaging it's like we get it. Like everyone knows what good or bad food is for the most part, except
Yeah.
there's obviously a nuanced conversation to be had there. Another thing is I think you might have even brought this up on your Instagram. Is this? I saw a post. I'm not going to say who. I'm not going to drop any names, but it said something. I'm going to paraphrase, but it was being obese isn't a choice, but getting healthy is. And I found that to be the most ridiculous contradiction because you are saying that to be at one state is not your like to me like how I view my life in general is everything is my fault. Like Jocko Willink, extreme ownership,
Yeah.
everything is my fault in life, whether that be my successes or my failures. And I think that this woke like virtue signaling in the health and fitness space, like I'm not going to bring up politics. I don't care what your political leanings are, but just in general, like not taking personal responsibility for where you're at. Like what do you think about that messaging?
I so lately I've been hearing a lot of people ask the question like, is obesity a choice? And the reason why I don't like that is because it's reductionist. And so if you were to say, is obesity a choice, you would have to say no, because there's genetic components that are outside of your control. There's other components that are also outside of your control that are environmental.
Mhm.
So you would have to say no because there is a proportion of that is just sort of immutable. It's like, you know what, this is just the cards you're dealt with. The reason why that sucks though is because people don't know what that means. Like, how often do people read headlines and then actually read the article? Almost never, right? And so usually people just go pick something up and they run with it, regardless of whether or not it's true. It's probably just more important that it fits within their current framework of the world, right? So, like, this is sort of my issue when people started talking about obesity as a disease. Clinically, it makes sense. Obesity is a disease, right? Like, if you understand the actual clinical definition, like the relevancy of that within the clinical literature, it is absolutely a disease that is indisputable, right? However, when you say obesity is a disease to the general public, what the fuck do you think they think? They don't understand even the difference of like a non-communicable disease. They don't understand what that is. People are thinking this is like cancer. They're thinking like, they're like, oh, I just have obesity. It's like, no, that's not what this means.
Yeah.
And the thing that's really frustrating is that people will fucking argue and debate over whether or not you should use clean or dirty foods, like say clean or dirty in reference to foods, because that could fuck with an individual's perception of what that actually means. Yet they're totally okay with framing these conversations in a wildly inaccurate way that disproportionately frames it as if an individual has little or no um, choice on their body weight or control over the body weight.
Mm.
And it's just completely disingenuous, right? So the reality is obesity is very complex. It is mediated by many, many variables. I actually wrote a review paper on this, a literature review. It's over 17,000 words. It's a fucking huge article because there's a lot
Yeah.
of stuff that goes into it, right? However, at no point in that article did I ever say this is outside of your control, because it's not. It's just, it's important to understand the context that people are making these statements. So, for instance, if I say um, genetics play a role, right? Some people have augmented hunger signaling. So in obesity, for instance, there's a what researchers have seen is they've observed somewhat of a blunted reward mechanism, right? So you normally you eat food, you get this sort of reward, and then you're like, okay, I'm good. I don't need any more of it.
Mm.
Whereas that sort of feedback loop is sort of disrupted. So they need to eat more in order to get an equivocal response, you know? Now, the reason why this is like disingenuous in terms of how it's often framed in conversation is, well, do people have that and become obese, or does obesity cause that? And there is a lot of research to show that obesity actually is a cause of that to some degree, right? And beyond that, how much does that influence the outcome? What's the order of magnitude, or what's the effect size that that actually has on your predisposition to become obese? And the thing is that I don't like is that these are not hard-lined things. People will talk about it as if it's like, oh, this, is responsible for, let's say, 20% of the variance or 5% of the variance or whatever. But the reality is it doesn't exist like that. It's contextual and it depends on all of the other variables as well. But people are presenting these things as if it's like, oh, most people have genetic conditions and that's why they're obese. Most people have dysregulated hunger signaling. Most people, it's like, it's always framed like that. And then there's very seldom a time where I actually see people talking about what you can do. It's like, hey, these are realities. Yes, hunger signaling can be messed up. Yes, your environment absolutely plays a role, to some extent in your in your eating behavior and adherence. The type of intervention that you select plays a huge role. Your social circle, social support, all of these things play a massive role. But how big of a role, and what are the things you can actually do to make the best out of a bad situation,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
All I ever hear is people talking about like, oh, it's because of this and this and this and this. And then it's like there's no actual solution presented. It's like, okay, so we're just telling all people they're fucked and they're not
Yeah.
doing anything about it, you know? So I have a real problem with how it's being framed. It's like the information they're sharing is accurate, but it's being framed in a way that the average user is going to misinterpret it and
Mm.
become like deflated essentially, you know? Now, like I have PTSD, and when I first got the diagnosis that, hey, you have PTSD, it's pretty severe, that was a huge relief for me because I was like, oh, my life makes a lot more sense now. I
Mm.
can understand my responses to things. I can understand my, hypervigilance to things. This makes sense. So I think it's very important that we, destigmatize some of these things. So we do talk about the genetic variables. We do talk about the environmental factors. We do talk about the social factors, the, intrinsic factors that sort of mediate obesity collectively, right? But I also think it's important to contextualize it and then also ground that in what can you do, right?
Mm.
If you do have a disadvantage, what can you do in spite of the disadvantage? And that conversation hasn't really happened yet to an extent that would really sort of be like, okay, yeah, we're on the right track. Now it's coming. It is
Mm.
coming because, all of these things are kind of polarities, right? Like before there was a lot of fat shaming, there's a lot of fat stigma. Now
We're going
being
the opposite
overweight
way.
is way, way more acceptable, right? We see them on magazines, we see overweight people, we see like,
Yeah.
like if you post a photo of like being overweight and getting and having stretch marks, what are you going to get in your comments? You're beautiful. You're so brave. You're gorgeous. Oh my God. Thank you for sharing this. Like
Mhm.
you're such a great whatever, right? You're going to get a couple assholes. If you have a huge following, you're going to get a couple assholes saying some mean shit. But the
Yeah.
overwhelming majority is going to be giving you approbation and support because it's just not acceptable. Regardless of what people say, it's just not acceptable to publicly fat shame people. On
Mhm.
social media, things happen and whatever, but like Could you imagine what would happen if you were like out at a restaurant and you just saw some random person go up to like some older woman who was like really overweight and being like, "You fat fucked up." It's like,
Yeah.
for a second,
That's what,
everyone else wouldn't
yeah.
stand up and be like, "Hey, what the fuck are you doing? Get the hell out of here."
Regardless of what your opinion is on, obesity and like,
Yeah.
you should never shame. I'm totally against body shaming of any kind. I think it's just what, social media has. I think about this because even in my personal life, my pendulum swung, like whether that be like politically or how I
Mhm.
feel about certain fitness things.
Yeah.
But yeah, social media in general is how we conduct ourselves in a manner that we would never conduct ourselves in the real world. Like you said, you wouldn't even some of these more like anti-woke fitness influencers, well, when they'll like post some, you were talking about like some overweight lady in a magazine, they'll be like, this is ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. It's like, I see what you're saying, but like, it's kind of weird that they're kind of like publicly shaming people. I don't know. It's there's a balance to be struck there. But I totally agree with pretty much everything you said there. Those are all really good points. Um, yeah, I don't really know where else we can go from that. That was a good little rant right there. Actually, maybe to end off here. What do you think, like moving forward, we're kind of pointing out some problems in the industry, but moving forward, what does this conversation look like in order to make it a more balanced approach that puts the emphasis back on personal responsibility? I guess in the context of being a fitness educator.
Yeah. Um, you know, ultimately, I think that in America, there's like, sorry, when I say America, I'm kind of referring to North America
Yeah.
broadly. I think there's like a significant concern over just honest conversations. You know, um, I often see people, supporting things that I know they don't agree with. Like I know they don't actually support because I know them in person. Meanwhile, they're sharing it and they're liking it. And they're, oh yes, da da da, and stuff. And it's just
Yeah.
like
That's really weird.
I'm not even talking about just fitness anymore. I'm just talking about broadly speaking, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a very clear ideological bias where it's like these are the things to support, and if you don't support these things, then you're a piece of shit, and we're going to cancel
Yeah.
you. I think that's a massive problem
Hmm.
because the moment that you can't have productive conversations, and I want to highlight the fact that I'm saying productive conversations, not just yelling matches, the more that we can do that, the more that we can actually come to some sort of better understanding of the truth and what that actually is, right? So, for instance, why do we have so much more wide acceptance about people being overweight? Well, for one, people who are overweight have been humanized to a large extent, you know? Like people talk about their actual struggles, they talk about their insecurities, they talk about, hey, I was on a plane and I had to get like a seatbelt extender, and that was fucking humiliating. Like these are real people who are going through real difficulties.
Hmm.
And I think that when that conversation started happening, all of the people, not all of the people, but a fucking huge amount of the people who were at that extreme, who were like, oh, fat people are gross, or whatever the fuck people think,
Yeah.
they were like, oh wow, man, that must suck. And now all of a sudden they have empathy. And now they can understand the situation better because they're actually understanding the opposite side. But in order to actually gain a good understanding of a subject, you need to understand both sides. Or if there's multiple sides, you need to understand multiple sides. And so I think one of the big benefits of this kind of movement towards destigmatizing body weight and body image is exactly that. Now a lot of these things are more accepted. People who are overweight or don't necessarily fit a particular uh, physical appearance are gaining a lot more acceptance, and it's not really that big of a deal anymore. Now, is it perfect? No. And is there still progress to be made? Absolutely. But the only reason why that progress is happening is because there's a conversation around it. So I think that's really good. However, if you look at people who are making an alternate, you know, not even argument, but let's say who are having discussions, being like, whoa, 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 we need to kind of pump the brakes on this a little bit. Well, why are those people having that conversation? What does that conversation look like? Has anyone listened to them? Maybe, maybe not, you know? So, for instance, I do have a very big issue with how some of these things are being hijacked. So, for instance,
Mhm.
the whole body positivity thing and the sort of promoting like anti-weight stigma, feeling good about yourself, all of that is fantastic. It's
Mhm.
fucking fantastic. I'm a huge fan of that, right? However, there's people who are hijacking that, which is exactly what you see with any really productive cause. There starts out with this awesome thing. We have these great ideas, and it's like, hey, let's push this forward. And then there's a small group of individuals who just take it and now claim it as part of their own. And now everything they say is part of this. They attach themselves to it when in reality they're two distinctly different things. So, like, I've literally heard people say, if you exercise for any other reason than health, you're fat phobic. I've heard people say if you don't find overweight women attractive or overweight men attractive, you're fat phobic.
Yeah.
It's like, man, how about personal preference? You
Yeah.
know? And unfortunately, those are the people that get the spotlight. And
Yeah.
those are the people who are the, quote unquote representatives of these bigger movements. And they're
Mhm.
not. It's like those guys can go fuck themselves.
Yeah.
Sorry, if you want to tell me what my personal preference is in a man or a woman, go fuck yourself.
Yeah.
You know,
100%.
like
100%.
that's like let's say I have a view on, oh gosh, I don't know, like philanthropy. Philanthropy super important to me, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, you're a piece of shit. Fuck you. You're not- it's your life. You can do whatever you want. My life is this, and I'm not going to tell other people what to do, but don't tell me how to live my life. You know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
absolutely ridiculous, and it's super just disingenuous. And it's unfortunate those people are getting so much attention because now that's kind of what everyone says, like, oh, all this body positivity stuff. It's like, I do have an issue with body positivity when it's hijacked by those individuals. But
Yeah.
body positivity in general is really good, you know? And the thing is, I think that the more we can have actual conversations about this stuff, the more that those shitty ideas are just going to sort of weed themselves out. And the more that people from both ends of the spectrum are going to realize they actually probably agree on much more than they disagree on. Because I've
100%.
spoken I've spoken with so many people, and I invite people on my podcast all the time who I feel like are experts. And sometimes I challenge them. I'm like, I don't know about this, like, and I'll kind of push back. And then they create they're like, oh, well, what about this? What about this? I'm like, oh, wow, I never thought of it that way, you know?
Mm.
And I end up learning a lot. And then by the end of it, I'm like, you know what? I actually learned a lot and I agree with you on this and this. And then they'll come back and be like, you know what? I actually learned a lot and I agree with you on this and this. And it's like we both still kind of believe similar things, but now we're just a little bit closer. There's less disagreement and it's much easier to bridge that gap.
Mhm.
And then because bad ideas always crumble when you shine a light on them. They
100%.
always will crumble. The only way to keep a bad idea around is to not allow anyone to talk about it. And a lot of the times it's under the guise of, oh, sparing someone's feelings or, oh, this information is harmful. It's like information is not harmful. You know, censorship of information is harmful. Anytime you start hearing people being like, oh, well, I don't say that because it's like, no, these are individuals. They're adults. If you actually respect them, let them make the decision for themselves. Give
Yeah.
them all the information from both sides or whatever sides there are that exist, and let them decide for themselves. That's what you do when you respect someone. When you don't respect someone, you hold their hands and try and protect them and coddle them. And right now, there's still a
100%.
little bit too much coddling going on in the fitness industry regarding, like, all of these things. And it's like, at what point do we lose resiliency now? you
Mm.
know because I'm not in the camp of like do whatever it takes, just be tough and willpower. Like, I'm not in that camp, but I'm also not in the will camp in the camp of making people fucking weak you
Yeah.
know so
Mm.
it's like we do need a certain amount of resiliency, but we also need a certain amount of compassion, understanding, and communication, right? And it's that sort of balance between the two that's sort of lacking, in my opinion. There's just this kind of dichotomy right now, and it doesn't even need to exist. So I think those conversations need to happen more. And the more that we have these conversations, and the more that you can kind of bridge that gap between sides, and the more that all of this like really radical sort of ideologies on both sides can sort
Mm.
of, stay in the fringe, and we can sort of be like, oh, okay, here's the beneficial stuff that came from this movement.
Boom. I agree with everything you just said, man. That's a great place to wrap this up. If you can let people know where they can find you, that'd be great.
Yeah. So first off, thanks for having me on, man. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. This is something I really enjoy doing. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of where people can find me, I'm most active on Instagram. It's Daniel_Debrocke. I have a YouTube channel, also Daniel Debrocke. I just started a TikTok, which I guess
You went to the dark side.
yeah. So that's Daniel_Debrocke. So I'll send you the links for that. I'm not sure if you have show notes or anything like that.
Yeah,
But,
yeah, I'll put that in
um,
there.
yeah, so you can find me there, and then I always respond to DMs and whatever on Instagram. It does take me a while because I get a ton, but I always get to them. I always answer questions and stuff like that. So yeah, you can find me there. I'm most
Cool,
active.
man. And your podcast, Stack Strength, are you pretty active with that?
Oh, right, yeah, yeah, yeah. So I release a new podcast every week um, on Wednesdays. So I believe now I'm at 80 episodes.
Nice.
So I've been doing one a week, and yeah, I've been pretty fortunate to have a pretty solid roster of guests. So
Yeah, you've had some big people on that, so congrats.
yeah, yeah, it's been a great opportunity to meet people. So
All right, man. Well, I appreciate you taking the time.
yeah, thanks a lot, man.
Yeah, peace.